afternoon. I'm Ana Devic. I'm a research fellow with Venice at KU Leuven, Department of Political Science. And it is my very special pleasure to introduce today Associate Professor Chiara Bonfiglioli, who is a historian at Foscari, University of Venice. She gave a talk today at our department on the non-alignment movement and the ways in which women's activism during the Cold War developed in the global South, outside of the main Cold War collisions and cooperations. And we're very inspired by it. Now we're going to have a more relaxed conversation in the form of a dialogue. Let me just say a few things about Chiara. She previously taught in gender and women's studies at University College Cork in Ireland, where she coordinated the one-year interdisciplinary master in women's studies. She published extensively on transnational women's and feminist history. She's the author of Women and Industry in the Balkans, The Rise and Fall of the Yugoslav Textile Sector, a book that came out in 2019. I already mentioned her current research project, which was awarded an ERC Consolidator grant, and that has just started. Chiara, could you add some points that are omitted from this very formal introduction that you think we should know about your work yourself?
Hi, Anna. Yes, of course. I will mention that I started with political sciences, so it's a pleasure today to be part of a talk in the Faculty of Social Sciences and at your institute. And I studied first development and cooperation, and then cultures and human rights. I changed in between. And then I moved towards gender studies, and gradually I was moving towards gender history. So I got my master and PhD in the graduate gender program at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And afterwards I had several postdoctoral fellowships, one at the University of Edinburgh within the CITSI project, which was an advanced ERC grant on citizenship in the successor state of Yugoslavia. And that's where I started my project on the textile workers and gender. And then later on, always with this project on the textile industry in the former Yugoslavia, I was at the Center for Cultural and Historical Research of Socialism at the University of Pula, which was also a center I cooperated with in a recent project on microsocialism, which investigated the microhistory of socialism in Croatia during the 70s and the 80s. And then I was at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where I had some time to write my book. And then, as you mentioned, I was teaching women's and gender studies in Cork for about 6 years until I was awarded this ERC grant and managed to move back to Italy, to Ca' Foscari, where I'm currently working.
Thank you. We'll start now with questions. What seems to be, at least for me, the most interesting thing is how a scholar becomes interested in topics that are not simply forgotten due to the fact that they took place long ago in the seemingly forgotten Cold War, although, as we can see, not everything from Cold War gets so forgotten. So how did you develop your interest in both the history of textile workers, working class women, and now in the non-alignment movement, the topics that are not only marginalized but seem to be also banished in some places, literally? What was your academic and non-academic motivation?
Thank you. So for the textile workers, I really stumbled upon the topic. I didn't think I would spend 7 years working on it. I started doing this postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Edinburgh, and I came with an historical perspective from my PhD, which was about the women's organizations during the Cold War in Italy and Yugoslavia. But I was asked to work on something more contemporary, and that's when I heard about textile worker strike in, I think it was in the one by Kamensko workers in Zagreb, but might have been another strike. And then I thought, textile workers, it's really something that there hasn't been much work on, except for the work of Nina Vodopivec for Slovenia. So I thought that could be a good topic. And actually then I started to talk with friends and colleagues, and everybody seemed to have an aunt or a grandma that used to work in the textile industry in Yugoslavia, and that became a much bigger project than I envisaged. And when it comes to the non-aligned movement, as I mentioned, I wrote my dissertation on Cold War activism in Italy, Yugoslavia, and the border area in Trieste. And already back then, I was fascinated by how these organizations were connecting to the Women's International Democratic Federation, which was an organization of anti-fascist, communist, and socialist women founded in Paris in 1945, and which also became a global organization soon afterwards. And I thought these transnational connections were really interesting, also because they had been completely forgotten. Now, back then, when I started my PhD in 2008, there wasn't much literature. Then some more work started to be published, especially the works of Franziska de Haan and Christine Gozzi. But back then there wasn't really much. So I managed to connect with Franziska de Haan, and then I started to work on this side of the WADF, namely the Yugoslav and Italian branches, and also the branch in Trieste, because they were also affiliated as the Free Territory of Trieste to the WADF. And then I continued to work on the project a bit on the side while I was busy with the textile industry project. And then decided to come back to it as a potential ERC project, which will allow to study this transnational dimension of these exchanges more fully, because I really thought, it would be important to see sources not just from the Yugoslav side, but also from other countries in the global south that were involved in the non-aligned movement.
Thank you. Given the development of your interests, also how little has been written, while on the other hand, there is, as you mentioned, a growing interest and new approaches, the discovery of new places that people are studying that were outside of the Cold War lines of conflict and cooperation. Is there anything that you find, you mentioned what was inspiring for you, but is there anything that you find problematic in the prevailing historical and political science and other approaches to that part of Cold War era?
Well, I think there has been quite some work done on the Cold War era that was mainly based on high-level state diplomacy and really focusing on this more diplomatic, upper diplomatic cadres. But recently, there is a growing interest into grassroots organizing and what has been called the culture of Cold War. That's something that's been going on already for quite some time. This idea that actually the Cold War was not about the Iron Curtain. There were many, or not about the Iron Curtain only. There were many connections between East, South, West, South, also South-South connections. I think for the Yugoslav case, recently there has been quite some research into economic exchanges with global South countries, notably Libya, Zambia, all this investment project that were done by companies such as Energoprojekt. There is another new project at the University of Vienna on Yugoslav workers in Zambia, for instance, that's trying to change as well the scholarly state of the art in terms of looking at social history and global history together. But yes, even in these new approaches, there hasn't been much on women, and I think a gender perspective is missing, and also a gender perspective combined with a more grassroots perspective when it comes to the non-aligned movement. And in this, I was recently inspired by the work of the Afro-Asian Networks Research Collective. They published a manifesto in 2018, which is arguing that we need to look into less prominent figures, not just heads of state, but also, for instance, journalists, artists, female humanitarians, all these different figures that were somehow connecting across borders that we don't know enough about yet.
In your current project, the one that you haven't touched upon during your lecture, but we know about it, you deal with transnational links between anti-war, anti-nationalist feminist groups in the post-Yugoslav, then still Yugoslav place in the early 90s, in Serbia in particular, and their links to Italian feminist groups. So what do you hope to illuminate with this study of their transnational links? And I'm particularly interested to what extent you could relate, or whether you think it's important to look at it as a transnational left.
Yes, so I stumbled upon this material again almost by chance, because I got to know somebody who was part of the feminist movement in Venice back then, and I remember that there used to be this meeting of Yugoslav women in Venice in February 92, and I thought, okay, is there some material? And I asked, oh yeah, and then they told me, yeah, all the material is at this women's library in Mestre, so in the mainland, outside Venice. And then in this library, they basically kept all the transcriptions from all the interventions of these two meetings. So there were these two meetings that happened. One was in Venice in February 92, and the other was in Novi Sad in July 92. And it was an interesting moment because it was just when the war in Croatia was going on, but the war in Bosnia hadn't broken out yet, right, until April 92. And so what happened is that there were some women from the peace movement and feminist movement that had created some connections with women from the former Yugoslavia when they reached Sarajevo in September 91 with a peace caravan, Caravana della Pace. And that's when they also met Stasha Zajovic, who is one of the leading figures of the Women in Black in Belgrade. And Stasha Zajovic herself said that she started to have this Women in Black practice of protest out of this meeting with the Italian women, because the Italian women brought this practice from the Israeli women that they had met in some of these peace activities in Israel, right? So the Women in Black originally started in Israel in 1988. And then the Italian women did this practice of standing dressed in black in the main square in Venice and in other cities during the Gulf War. And then that's how this got also to Serbia and to Belgrade. And they also mentioned that some women were doing this in Koper, in Capodistria at the same time. So that I found really interesting, this transfer of protest practice, and also what emerged from these meetings is that there was a big split already between the Croatian women from Croatia that had been invited to Venice and women from Belgrade, Pančevo, Novi Sad, because the Croatian women almost asked the Italian women to take side in the war. They said, we are being aggressed, we are the victims here, you should take side. But the Italian women were reluctant to take sides, and I thought there should be a bit more of a dialogue. And so that's when what Anna Miškovka-Kajewska calls the so-called Zagreb nationalists, they split from this wider trans-Yugoslav movement that was feminist and anti-nationalist. And then there was a subsequent split within Croatia between the so-called nationalists and self-defined anti-nationalists. That's how she calls them in the book Feminists at War, right? So the main story that I found was the story of the friendship and connection that instead the Italian women from Venice built with the women from Belgrade, Pančevo, and Novi Sad. They really created a strong friendship, and then they also started to translate each other's writings on issues such as gender, nationalism, what does it mean to have a fatherland, what does it mean to have national belonging. And they had a really interesting writing about how the fatherland needs to be a motherland, and it needs to be rooted in the body. So I was fascinated by how they were using this second wave feminist language to talk to each other. and also how these friendships between them sustained their activism at the moment in which women in Serbia were very isolated. They were undergoing the embargo at a certain point in spring 92. So they felt that this connection with the Italian women really was keeping them going. And there were some very interesting letters by Stasha Zajovic saying, "We are here in our ghetto. Come and visit us. Please come and visit us. We really feel like it's important for you to come." And then after the Italian women came in summer 92 in Novi Sad, all of them were overjoyed, and they said, "Look, obviously we're doing something good because we have friends from abroad that are coming to visit us." So you could really feel this energy. And what I was lucky also to find are the writings of one of the organizers from Venice. Her name is Tiziana Plebani. She's an historian, and she writes essays. She used to work in Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, and she wrote beautiful diaries of this meeting. So this kind of travel diaries, but also diary of the Venice meeting. And then she wrote some essays about these issues of belonging that Stasha Zajovic and others translated for their brochures. And she also shared some of the letters that she was receiving from the women from Serbia, and some of the postcards that they sent to her, and they were absolutely fascinating. And I think, and I talked to her as well because I knew her from before. So we had a short interview. Then I had another short interview with Ildiko Erdej, who was a professor of ethnology in Belgrade. She's from Pančevo. And she was also mentioning some interesting details of the Novi Sad meeting, how she felt, important this support from abroad. So I think in the end, the issue of friendship really came out very strong from this. And also the issue of the energy and the details, like how these women were facing this context of war, but at the same time they would be in Venice and they would dress up and put makeup on to go to the carnival, or there were all these interesting details, or they were discussing like the American actors they like the most, or so there were all these interesting, fascinating small details about the energy and how that they felt that they were exchanging some positive energy with each other. So I don't know how this is gonna change the history of the left, or the how it's going to contribute to transnational history of the left, but I think it's definitely going to put some light into the importance of personal connections in social movements, maybe.
Well, especially because these meetings were sustained. You're focusing on the two, but the international meetings between Italian, Spanish, Danish, German women coming every year to Novi Sad seminar, which was a regular summer annual event with lots of workshops. So that contribution from abroad was quite important. Also, what I also meant, transnational left, it's linked to the split between nationalists and anti-nationalists in Croatia, where there is also a link to the pre-war feminist networks. And also the Croatian women after 93 were coming to Serbia to the meetings, even though the visa regime was quite problematic. So I think that transnational also relates to what was going on
within the post-Yugoslav context. And I think it's good to get shed some light onto some of these women, because indeed there has been a bit of research done on the so-called patriotic feminists, but we don't know much about them, right? And so there were some names that came out of, like Ivana Radic and Mirjana Čupić and Asja Armanda, that they're not that well known in terms of writings in the post-war context. So I thought it was fascinating that group specifically went to that Venice meeting, and not the most well-known anti-nationalist activists such as Vesna Kesic and others.
Okay, so just to end with a little note on how do you see this activist part of your motivation mixing with academic requirements? I would say very successfully, but can you just give some additional note to that?
Yeah, I thought this was the most difficult questions of all. But yeah, I'll try. So I think, in a way, what I was mentioning in the lecture is that the legacy of these movements can give some inspiration in terms of intersectional thought or pre-intersectional thought, and how we should be looking at gender inequalities in relation to class, race, and wider geopolitical inequalities. And that's something that was very pressing within the works of women active in non-alignment. Also, I think it's important to look at the history of coalitions such as the non-aligned movement, especially seeing what's happening right now in Gaza, and how the Global South is taking the lead in asking for the respect of international humanitarian law. And I think that's something that it's somehow timely, this idea of, okay, who is international law for, and how can we get to a better application or understanding of international law? Because at the moment it looks like this post-World War II international law system is somehow collapsing, right? So I think that's important to get back to that and see the investment of countries such as Yugoslavia and the Global South into the United Nations and other organizations that were really somehow connecting this interest in self-determination and especially after colonialism.
Thank you, Chiara. We can just wish you luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you.